If I asked you what book lies at the foundation of Western civilization, you would probably say either the Bible or the Iliad. But I think it's actually Virgil's Aeneid which created the foundation of European civilization as we know it. And no, I'm not just shilling for my Roman ancestors. There's actually something very interesting to this. I think Virgil's Aeneid actually stretches into the deep mythic and historical past and might preserve memories of the coming of the Indo-Europeans to Europe. But first, let's look at the two obvious choices, the Bible and the Iliad. If you want to understand European literary, artistic, and historical references, the Bible is an absolute essential. There's no doubt about that. But by the time Christianity came to Europe, the moral, legal, ethnic, linguistic, even religious foundations of European civilization had already long been in place, at least since the Bronze Age. So to say that the Bible created Western civilization would be to exclude the Greeks, the Romans, the pre-Christian civilizations of the Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic peoples, and really a large part of even the Middle Ages. So then what about the Iliad? Didn't Western civilization begin with the Greeks? I think it's true to say that the ancient Greeks represented the first major European civilization in the historical period. There were definitely civilizations in Europe before the ancient Greeks and contemporary with them. The Celts, for example, dominated mainland Europe, but we don't have much writing from them, and therefore they didn't affect the cultures after them as much as the ancient Greeks did. We could trace the genesis of Europe as we know it back to the Indo-European migrations, but there isn't much evidence about what was taking place in Europe before then. So it makes sense that people say the ancient Greeks were the foundation of Western civilization. And the Iliad and Odyssey are certainly the oldest European texts which depict the pan-European heroic value system, which was the foundation of European civilization even through the Christian Middle Ages. However, the Greeks did not view themselves as Europeans as we understand that term today. They were not aware of the values which they shared with the Celtic and Germanic peoples all the way in the north. To the Greeks, they seemed like distant barbarians, not kin and cousins. The Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, believed that the Egyptians were the source of Greek religion and civilization. We, of course, know that this is wrong, although there was doubtless influence. But it makes sense given the antiquity and mystique of Egyptian civilization. So from our perspective, the Greeks may be the cornerstone of Western civilization in the historical period, and the Iliad may be the first work to encapsulate the values and spirit of Europe. The Greeks themselves were unaware of these wider implications. They weren't thinking in pan-European terms during the Bronze Age, when the events of the Iliad would have been happening. This is where the Aeneid comes in. The Aeneid is about the Trojan hero Aeneas fleeing Troy with the remnants of his people after Troy is sacked by the Greeks and seeking out Italy, where his descendants are destined to found the great Roman Empire. In the Aeneid, Virgil does two important things. Firstly, he sets up Roman civilization as a continuation of Greek civilization. Even though the Greeks and Trojans are, of course, enemies in the Iliad and the Aeneid, by connecting the Trojans to the Romans, Virgil roots Roman civilization and the destiny of the Roman Empire in the same epic cycle that served as the foundation of the Greek mythic world. This also cleverly justifies the Roman conquest of the Greeks. And this isn't just a substanceless self-insert, like the idea that the Irish or the English were one of the lost tribes of Israel or something like that. The Romans really did inherit and continue Greek culture to a large degree, since they received considerable Hellenic influence in the Republic period and adopted much of Greek myth, philosophy, and literature as their own. The very fact that the Aeneid, the Roman epic, ties into the Greek epic cycle, or that one of the largest compilations of Greek myth, Ovid's Metamorphoses, was penned in Latin, shows us this. So Virgil was only grounding this already existent cultural connection in history and myth. Now, the second thing that Virgil does in the Aeneid is create the idea of historical destiny. Aeneas is not driven by a personal fate like Achilles and Odysseus, but rather by the destiny of his people and the empire his descendants will found, the fate of those to come, like Julius Caesar, whose namesake and ancestor, according to Virgil, is Aeneas's own son, Iulus. Aeneas is pulled into the future through a duty to this empire which is not yet realized and which he in fact will never see. So this really is the first example of one European civilization, Roman civilization, consciously setting itself up as the inheritor and continuer of an earlier one, Greek civilization, with a vision of historical destiny projected into the future. Now things got really interesting when the Roman Empire fell and the Franks, who had been Romanized, adopted Roman identity, Roman culture, which towards the final days of the Western Roman Empire's independence before Germanic rule had become Christian. And so the Franks began to identify themselves as both Romans and, more interestingly, as Trojans. When Charlemagne was crowned, it was as Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne and the Franks did not think Roman civilization had ended any more than the Romans thought that Greek civilization had died. The Franks viewed themselves as continuers of Roman rule, law, and empire, and Carolingian chroniclers such as Fredegar wrote that the Franks were direct descendants of the Trojans. So they did the exact same thing that the Romans did, tying themselves into what was originally the Greek epic cycle set during the Bronze Age. During the Crusades, the conflict between the Western inheritors of Rome and the Greek Byzantines was even sometimes understood as a continuation of the Trojan-Greek conflict which began during the Trojan War. The English also took up the idea of Roman descent, with the historian Geoffrey of Monmouth writing that Brutus, the grandson of Aeneas, founded Britain, and some of the earliest Arthurian texts, like Layamon's Brut, named after Brutus, depicts Arthur as a direct descendant of Aeneas. The alliterative Death of Arthur, written in the late 1400s, depicts Arthur as the last of Brutus's line, the last Trojan king in Britain, and with him dies the great heroic age that began all those years ago in Troy. This English adoption of Trojan identity set up the American founding fathers' use of symbolism to depict the US as a continuation of Rome's legacy, of Troy's legacy, which had been passed from the Romans to the British through Brutus. They saw themselves as a people fleeing their own homeland, like the Trojans, to found a new Rome on a new continent, as was their destiny ordained by God. Again, here you have this idea of historical destiny. I talked about this in more detail in another video about the pagan roots of the American Republic. Now, so far all of this is pretty basic, but we're going to get schizo in a moment. Just to review, in the Aeneid, Virgil created the mythic foundation which would be used to link various European peoples and civilizations throughout history, therefore creating the idea of a continuous European civilization passed by one people to another, all sharing distant kinship ties and the same mythic past. But this is where it gets interesting. This myth reflects reality remarkably well. It's exceedingly unlikely that the Franks were in any way descendants or kin of the historical Trojans. However, the European peoples all share close ethnic, linguistic, and cultural ties, many of which originated with the Indo-European migrations from the steppe into Europe. And what we have in the myth of Trojan Descent is a story about successive waves of migration from the east into Europe, where these Trojans integrate with the locals and form various kingdoms and civilizations, the Romans, the Franks, the British. And that is basically exactly what happened with the Indo-Europeans. And it's why every ancient people of Europe spoke an Indo-European language, had similar religions, often shared cognate deities, and most importantly, had almost identical heroic worldviews and value systems. So when viewed through this lens, the myth of Trojan descent wasn't just a useful myth. It actually got right, perhaps because of some distant memory, the rough details of the ancient genesis of Europe's peoples and cultures with the coming of a warlike, noble, and ancient people from the east. Now, of course, this could just be a coincidence, but when we zoom out, we actually see the same mythic pattern among the Germanic peoples and Celts. There was no Trojan descent myth among the Germanic peoples, as far as I know. The German Empire, which occupied much of Central Europe during the Middle Ages, was of course called the Holy Roman Empire. and the Germanic tribes took control of Western Rome when it eventually collapsed, continuing Roman institutions and law. But as far as I know, there was no widespread idea that the Germanic peoples were descended from the Trojans. However, the Germanic legendary cycle also includes the idea of migration out of the east. Most of Germanic legend on both the continent and in Scandinavia is set during the migration period, just after the fall of Rome, and revolves around the conflict between the Goths and the Huns. As the Huns pushed into Europe during the decline of Roman power, they displaced the Goths from the steppe, the exact same region which was the homeland of the Indo-Europeans. The Huns' incursion into Europe stirred up the Germanic tribes which had originally migrated out of the Jutland Peninsula and settled across Europe. Therefore, their epic cycle, preserved in the Norse sagas and in some continental Germanic works, details the same pattern of conflict with and migration out of the east. But in this case, it was based on an actual historical event, the Huns' incursion into Europe, which just happened to mirror the original Indo-European migrations. Yet still it holds echoes of Europe's deep past. The Irish also don't have a Trojan origin myth as far as I'm aware, but I think there's a much stronger case for an actual memory of the Indo-European migrations being preserved in their mythic literature. The main Irish heroic cycle revolves around the hero Cuchulainn. I recommend you read Kinzella's translation of the Táin, it's very good, but for our purposes here, it's the Book of Invasions that interests us. The Book of Invasions is a medieval compilation assembled in the 11th and 12th centuries that chronicles Ireland's mythic past as a sequence of invasions or settlements by different peoples. And this is a relatively late text for us to take it at face value as a completely accurate chronicle of pagan myth. It attempts to tie much of this ancient mythology into the Bible, for example. But it very well could preserve a memory of the Indo-European settlement of Ireland and the English Isles, or perhaps even an older myth from the mainland when the Celtic world stretched across Europe. Either way, we see the same myth of successive waves of settlement out of the east, and the idea that the various European peoples are the lost tribes of Israel who wandered into Europe also fits this pattern. All of this is to say that the reason why the Trojan migration myth resonated so strongly may be because of an ancient memory of the Indo-European migrations, a pattern which was then repeated throughout European history. More concretely, the Aeneid gained such prominence in Western Europe during the Middle Ages because the Iliad and Odyssey were largely unavailable, and the Norse sagas were not widely known. Therefore, it was not the Iliad or Odyssey, not even the Bible, but the Aeneid, which laid the foundations of an interconnected Europe, one with a sense of historical identity spanning into the past and projected into the future, a sense of ancient kinship bonds, and a shared mythic world. And it is precisely these ancient mythic bonds and this sense of historical destiny which gave our ancestors continuity with the past, meaning in the present, and a destiny in the future. And if only we remember our ancient myths, they might do the same for us. If you want an in-depth discussion of the entire Greco-Roman epic cycle and the Norse legendary cycle, check out my heroic literature course and community. The link is in the description.